This is A Geek Leader. Hey, Geek Leaders, welcome to episode 135 of the podcast, and this is coming out just before Christmas, so Merry Christmas. And this episode is sponsored by Splashtop. Splashtop is the preferred remote access and remote support software. There are three main products that you can choose from depending on who you are and what you need. Splashtop Business Access for individuals and small teams. That's one of the products that I use personally and love it. Splashtop Remote Support for IT and MSPs. We also use that at our company, and it's a fantastic solution. And Splashtop SOS for support and help desk teams. Splashtop uses robust security measures, keeping your data safe and protecting all of your employees and computers that you are accessing. And you can start a free trial today, and you'll see why so many users are leaving other remote access softwares and switching to Splashtop, because you get all the same features, better performance at a fraction of the cost. And if you don't believe it, you should at least try it out. Get a free trial plus 20% off for any listeners to A Geek Leader. Just go to ageekleader.com/splashtop. Again, I've been using this software for 7 years, and from a personal standpoint and from the professional standpoint, it is fantastic. I love using it with my iPad, with my iPhone, being able to remote into Windows and Mac machines. It's a great solution, highly recommended. For 20% off and a free trial, go to ageekleader.com/splashtop. All right, Geek Leaders. Today on the show, we've got Mark Kahan. He's a serial entrepreneur and currently serving as the Chief Marketing Officer at Thycotic. And he's got a book to tell us about. It's the Be a Startup Superstar. And I'm really interested in this because it helps us figure out like career paths for young professionals, for software developers, for engineers. And it's a different alternative than getting that comfortable job that a lot of us think about when we want to get into the corporate America and put in our 9 to 5. But before we get into that, Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. And thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about how you got started in your career, kind of where you've been, because I know you've been a part of several startups, and where you are today, and kind of how that journey's been, to lay some context for the conversation.
Sure. So I've actually been with 6 startups. Thycotic now is my 7th, all of whom have successfully exited either through acquisition or through IPO, generating over $3 billion in shareholder value. And actually, my career journey, like many, is sort of a winding road, but it starts out in an interesting way, where I remember going way back to college when I would have conversations with my father, who used to tell me, go to work, get a degree, go to work for a large corporation, you work hard, they'll take care of you, and you will have a great career. And that's what I did. So I started working, actually processing claims at a large organization, and I suddenly discovered that I had was down once again to $50 in my bank account, and the student loans would eat my paycheck before it ever had a chance to hit my bank account. And so I asked myself, how could I earn a great living loving the work that I do? And that quickly led me into the startup world, and I have been there ever since.
Awesome. Yeah, I that whole student loan thing kind of just drives me crazy. And I teach part-time at the university and at Winthrop University, and I can look back and I think, is it really worth, some careers you can get without going to college, but most of our listeners have already gone to college or in college now, so I guess that ship has mostly sailed for them. But yeah, so when you found yourself in that situation where your student loans were kind of eating your paycheck and you needed to make a change, what was that like?
So what that was like is that I decided that the corporate world wasn't for me. When I thought about sort of a lot of folks with incumbent mindsets, where I was, as many people are in large organizations, pigeonholed into smaller roles with sort of a fairly bureaucratic environment where the status quo is one that's very accepted. I sort of made the switch to the startup world, and I did everything wrong that you could possibly do. And I remember this was many years ago, and I went to work for a startup in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I'll never forget, on my first day, I looked at the office next to mine, and there were people unplugging the copy machine, putting it on a dolly, and literally rolling it right out of the office.
Mm.
And I came to find out a few days later is because the company couldn't afford to pay for the copy machine. And I was blind to it. I was just so pumped and excited to work with a small team of crazies hell bent on changing the world. And in that case, changing the way applications were being developed. And so I took the opportunity to learn everything I could. And just a few years later, that company went public, and I got the bug and never left the startup world.
So, what makes working at a startup different than going to some big bank? Or, and I always say bank because in my area near Charlotte, North Carolina, we have it's probably like the bank headquarter of the world. It seems like with Bank of America, Wells Fargo's, SunTrust, BB&T, and all of them right here. So I always use them as a reference. But going to a big company like that versus feeling your way around a startup.
So I think that startups are characterized by some things that people who consider themselves to be entrepreneurial absolutely love, right? And so let me lay out what some of those characteristics are. They typically startups sort of dart around like speedboats vis-a-vis the large giant ships that have all the money in the world and all the resources in the world that you're oftentimes competing with. They tend, in that I've seen, to be far more innovative, far more willing to take risks, make big bets. They move fast. They're nimble. I think that there's frequent change, and I think one of the parts that is particularly that I've loved beyond having access to the leaders. For example, if you work at GE, good luck getting a chance to meet the CEO, let alone someone in the C-suite. And you're working side by side with the execs at a small company, but it's also the versatility in roles. And so you really get a chance to focus in, build deep knowledge in wherever your zone of genius is, but then oftentimes, based on the success that you have, do completely different things maybe that you didn't even go to school to, which rounds out your experience, gives you a broader base that better positions you to the C-suite. And then, of course, the financial rewards at a startup, maybe some of the salaries might be a little bit less, but if you're fortunate enough to get into the right startup and get in with some good stock options, those certainly do have a chance to help you to achieve success at a super high level, just not only personally and professionally, but financially as well.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I know my wife got a job at a startup, and now I don't know when does the company change from being a startup to being kind of a large corporation, because that happens at some point. But when she started, it was really classified as a startup. They didn't even have. I think she was the first person in that role that she's in now. Now she manages the department of that role. But yeah, getting stock options, although the salary wasn't as good as other opportunities that were there, the exposure, the ability to learn, to try different things, to build your career in that facet was far outweighed the salary deficit. But then also, I guess being lucky, being part of one of those startups that went public, those stock options can help pay for your house, if it all works out right. But when is it that a company kind of switches from being a startup to being a corporation?
So I think that that's a great question, John, and so part of that sort of goes into defining what a startup actually is. And so, according to the United States Small Business Administration, they really define a startup as a company that's been in business for under a year and is in the formative stages. But that, to me, really paints a poor picture for what defines a startup. And I think the best definition that I've heard is from an entrepreneur. He's actually as chairman of a venture capital company by the name of Doug Irwin. And he says A startup is a company that operates like it's the last frontier for outlaws, a place where nonconformists can live, create, and sell their ideas. And to me, that's really cool. Who doesn't want to be involved in that? A place where you get to be the rough riding rebel in many ways, running circles around the slow moving, bureaucratic, large organizations. So I don't think it's so much of a size per se. I think it's a mentality. It's a culture. It's when I mentioned sort of a small team of crazies hell bent on believing down to their inner core they could change the world. There are companies at different sizes by way of revenue or employee counts that could really count at that. And that's what I think really characterizes and typifies a startup, more so than any specific definition as it relates to revenue, employees, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's more of a mindset because I've seen some companies that have been around for 4, 5, 6 years and they're still in that startup mentality and they're still operating like a startup, in my opinion. But then I've seen other companies kind of go from a startup to okay, now we're at a certain size. Let's put some stronger. I don't know if you want to call it policies or restrictions around the way we do things. Let's put some guidelines in. Let's put let's slow down a little bit. Things are working. Let's not change too much. Let's not rock the boat. And I feel like I do feel like it's a mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about it, if you think of some of the largest corporations in the world, particularly some organizations that have been around for a while, I would imagine that if you had a chance to have dinner with their CEO, that it would be amongst the top three things that if they could sort of wave a magic wand, it would be to get their employees to act more like a startup. And because that might really move the needle in terms of results and ultimately shareholder value.
Yeah, I know. I go back to my wife's company a lot because they went public and grew at a really alarming rate for a while, and then their CEO they did like a little town hall meeting with everybody. He's like, "Look, we're going to go back to the mentality of a startup. We can't slow down. We can't take this for granted. We need to celebrate it, but we also need to think like we're a startup. I want us to still be a startup." And he was like animate about that, and really pushing it forward.
Absolutely.
So how does, let's say, I teach part-time at Winthrop, so I'm always trying to get information for my students, and and some of my students are getting ready to graduate, they're moving on to the workforce, and some of them have signed signing bonuses with large corporate companies here in the Charlotte area, but other ones are interested in getting a job with a startup. How does somebody go about finding an opportunity for working at a startup?
So I will answer that question directly, but first I'd like to start with, if you think about students within university, and in particular the example that you gave, take the company that I'm with now. So we're a company that I've been with for 4 years. We were about 7 million when I started. This year we'll be approaching about 100 million. So just sort of amazing growth. And we're a company, and companies like us, we're we're based in Washington, D.C., and the chances are zero that we're going to be sending staff, for example, to Lawrence, Kansas to do interviewing at some sort of career festival, right? That's not what startups do. It's not where they are, but that's where the large companies are. And so when you think about sort of as a young professional or someone graduating, how to best find startups, the advice that I would give would be as follows. I think first and foremost, you can find great jobs online. And by the way, you don't need to be a techie to do this. So there are angel networks in every state around the United States where angel funded companies and well funded, I might add, that are listed right by Googling them, and they post their jobs right on this site. So you could sort of see in many states where there are hundreds of companies looking for people in all sorts of roles. So there are some little known places like that where you could directly find. I think also that a lot of startups are known for having hiring parties and advertising them locally. And we used to do that and still do that to this day, where we'll hang out outside, for example, and we'll crack open a few beers, have a company party, and we'll kind of do some limited advertising and sort of checking those out. But I think one of the best ways, and this is an example where I have specifically hired people in the past, is people who take a very sincere approach on LinkedIn Messenger. So I recently had an MBA student reach out to me in a very sincere and heartfelt way, right? I'm busy. There's a lot of hiring executives who are busy. But when people reach out to them, in particular young professionals that communicate a sincere desire of wanting to eliminate the trial and error approach to having a successful career, and what advice might they get? That direct contact via LinkedIn Messenger has certainly worked with me and with other technology executives that I know across multiple functions, where you have a chance to have a chat with a technology executive, share a little bit of what your desires are, what your background is, learn from that executive very specifically, and then very appropriately bridge into a discussion around how you, as someone who wants to be hired, might best go seek that opportunity. And as you're describing your background, then you could kind of see that there's a fit. So whether that's through a direct contact via LinkedIn Messenger, as an example, whether that's contacting that technology executive very directly online through some other mechanism, or by attending local seminars or events based on your own research of where these companies might be and having that very same discussion. I think that there are some very targeted and specific ways like that most young professionals rarely employ.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I've got a story about I'm pretty sure the guy's listening now because he comments on some of my episodes. But I had an opening at a company that I worked at before where I'm at now. This is long before I started the podcast, and I was still teaching part time at Winthrop. And a student came up to me. It wasn't one of my students, but it was a student that had done some research and realized that there was an opening at this company, and this professor works full time at this company. So I'm going to go talk to him. So he came and he said, "Hey, I saw you had this position. What do I need to do to get this position?" Or a job like this. And I said, well, here's the skills that we're looking for, that I'm looking to hire. And I asked him, a couple of questions like, hey, have you worked in .NET or what, C#? And I just mentioned a couple of things that we were looking for. And he didn't have that. And I said, well, you would need all that before I'd even consider interviewing you. And, he said, okay, well, I appreciate your time, and he left. And I thought very, very little of it. I thought, well, that was pretty bold of him to come and approach me. But now what's he going to do with it? Well, it was probably 2 or 3 months later, he showed up and he had printed off certificates from lynda.com where he had taken training on the things that I mentioned and said, I just completed all these courseworks. And I know I can't come in and be where you want me to be, as a full member, but can you at least hire me as a part-time basis so I can prove that I can learn this stuff and figure it out? And sure enough, I hired him and he became one of my best developers. And it was just kind of one of those things that oh my God, if you just make that effort to reach out to somebody and explain, ask the questions that that you need to know, and then do something about it, it means the world to, people that are in our positions.
Absolutely. And it's that passion, that hunger in the belly, that wanting to just get that chance to prove yourself. And certainly we've all been there, right? We've all sort of who have experienced some level of years in the professional world. That's where we came from too, right? And so when you see someone kind of take that approach, you really want to be able to help those folks. And most of the people that I know within the technology industry feel exactly that same way.
So let's say someone approaches you and you have a position that kind of aligns with this person's skill set or their interest or what they want to go to, and you want to offer them an interview. What do they need to be prepared for when they come into the interview? How should they dress? What should they bring with them? What kind of questions should they be prepared to answer? And what kind of mindset should they have coming into that interview?
I think that, first of all, they need to understand or try to quickly understand the culture of the company. So as it relates to dress, that is the best way to answer that question, because startup companies could be from a t-shirt and shorts and sandals to business casual, right? And so just being able to do a little bit of quick research online, you generally will be able to feel that out or get a sense of it. I think that as it relates to what makes an individual a standout candidate at a startup, I think there are some qualities for that. And so I think, to me, when I look at it, I look at the following qualities and attributes. First and foremost, I look for people who embrace accountability, people who want to be accountable for getting things done, right? And what we're talking about here is not being busy necessarily, but being busy towards accomplishing a specific goal and embracing accountability, not running from it. So that being one. Secondly, people who are good communicators, whether you are more technical or you're a sales or marketing, people who can communicate in thoughtful, smart, confident, and respectful ways, right? That really catches people's eye. And that communication is not just in what you say, it's really the questions that you ask and how you listen. And so while it might seem obvious, the questions that you ask and the listening part, it oftentimes isn't, because a lot of times people, they just want to come and talk because they feel pressure to communicate about themselves. And sometimes it's better to ask questions, and then you're able to frame that communication more appropriately. I think people who are we people versus I people, and in particular, this is important at a startup. You can tell an I person if they, for example, are talking about their experiences and they seem to take all of the credit personally on things. People who work hard, certainly, it almost goes without saying, but hard work it's just important to get ahead in life, startup or no. There is no easy button in my experience. And then for me, a couple of other attributes as well. People who pay attention to the details. So when things slip through the cracks, or there are details that oftentimes go underlooked, those details could be a misspelling in an email, as an example, right? And so it could be the simplest little thing that we might make because we text a lot and we do things in shorthand. But if you're sending a professional email and it looks like a text, that could have maybe an unintended sort of consequence. And then people who are persistent, that they have a level of tenacity where they're not going to give up easy. There are constant obstacles. Competitors are making constant moves. And so you can't be taken aback and be thrown for a loop all too easy. You've got to sort of pick yourself up and be ready to overcome the speed bumps along the way. And so to me, when I look at the core attributes, independent of role, of someone that I think makes a standout candidate at a startup, it would be really a lot of those qualities.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. We recently had the CIO for Abbott Exchange on, and she was saying that, being a good listener is kind of like the number one thing she looks for when she's hiring. And, being able to listen and communicate are kind of her two top attributes that she's looking for. So I think we nailed that with that list. So if I come in there and let's say I have most of those attributes, and I'm, putting that best foot forward, I dress the right part, I kind of show you somehow with examples that I'm persistent, that I'm a good communicator. and I listen to what you're saying, what kind of questions should I then ask you about the startup before I decide whether it's a position that I'm interested in or not?
So there are some questions I think, and I think some of these questions really are all around how you separate a startup with simply a good story, because there's a lot of them, versus a startup that has both a good story as well as a good chance for success, right? Because startups come with a side of risk; they don't all make it, and so the key is picking the right one, right? And so I like to ask some of these questions. So, for example, and I'm going to give you several because I think perhaps your listeners might be able to pick and choose from a few of these.
Yeah, go for
So,
it.
for example, why is now the time for your company to exist? Another one, what milestones has your company achieved? Another, what do you love about your team, and why is this company the company to solve the urgent problem in the marketplace? Another, where do you think your growth will come from in the next year? Tell me about your first paying customer and the revenue expectations for that customer over the next year. How much has your company raised and what is its runway? Who are your investors and why did you choose them? And here's one that oftentimes doesn't get asked that I think ought to, which is, if you weren't building a startup, what would you be doing? To me, those are sort of the maybe slightly unorthodox or maybe unconventional questions that people don't think of to ask, that really would uncover reams of great information and will tell you so much so you can make the best possible decision.
Wow, those are really good questions. I think even if you're not going for a startup to ask about, and I think a lot of people are so excited to get the interview, they forget about the fact that they're also interviewing that company that they're going for.
Right. And it's not only that, if you ask questions like that, that will blow the interviewer away.
Yeah.
I can assure you they don't get questions like that. And it's going to cause them to think. And that also sort of settles you down, gets you the information that you need, and they will be, even if your answers to the questions that they give don't rock their world, simply by asking these questions, you will rock their world.
Yeah, when I interview people, I almost always end with, so what questions do you have for me about the company, about the job, or about the position? And if they don't give me like really good questions, then it's done. If I don't get like a couple of really good questions about, what a typical day's like, what's the company's future outlook, what's the finances of the company look like, if it's something generic like, oh, well, what are your vacation time, or how much, just I don't care about that. Give me some good questions, and if you don't give me good questions, then we're done.
Absolutely. And by the way, if the answers to those questions are horrible, that tells you reams. It tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's say we find, I'm going through this whole scenario if you haven't figured it out. Let's say we find this startup, we interview and we nail them with some good questions, and they have good answers for those questions too. And they offer us the job. Do we negotiate the salary? What's that next step like? Or are we just so excited we accept on the phone on accident without negotiating, or what's that process like?
Well, I guess it always comes down to, at least in my view, is it depends. But my view is that if you sort of, I personally will rarely accept right on the spot. I might say, "Wow, this sounds fantastic. Could you give me some time to quickly think it over?" But what I've learned is particularly as it relates to salary, um, or other things that might be possible to negotiate. If you don't get those things up front, right, you're not going to get them in the first 6 months. And then that also sets you for where you're going to be, particularly from a salary perspective. And so, my sense is salary is always somewhat negotiable, and you should always take a shot, right? Just have some of the facts if you can. There's plenty of information out there, for example, on similar roles in different parts of the country on sites like salary.com. But if you have a chance to negotiate, now's the time when you have leverage. And so, given the scenario that we've been discussing, I think that if you have some things to negotiate, whether it is a salary, whether it is a little bit a work at home scenario, perhaps a day or two a week or whatever it might be, that this is the time to do that because you're in the best position to negotiate the best outcome.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If you don't do it up front, it's really hard to come back, 3 months later and say, well, I've done a great job. How about, give me more money now? So, well,
Right.
but also I think to your point about, there's more to negotiate than just salary. Now, some people don't think about all the things that could be on the table. And being with startup, you mentioned earlier that you're close to the executive team. Maybe part of your negotiation is that you have a monthly lunch with the CEO or co-founder or something like that, so that you can get a better idea of where the company's going and be part of that entry level, team that's always on top of what's going on and is staying in tune with the growth and direction of the business. It could be that you negotiate conferences that you want to attend, or that you negotiate more time off. There's always something.
Right. And I think that it's a time, for example, to negotiate your future growth and training and education. This is the perfect time to do that, whether it is you want to get an MBA or more technical skills or whatever it might be. This is the time that you would bring those sort of things up for sure. Stock options as well, right? And so this is absolutely the time. And I think one of the things that's often overlooked that I typically recommend to professionals whom I mentor is it's also a good time to then, once you're accepting the job, to literally define the type of relationship that you want to have with your hiring manager. And what I'm specifically referring to is to be able to define how you would, if you're going to sort of operate in an environment in which there are quarterly objectives, how do we want to define them? How often should we meet? What would be the best way and the frequency for us to communicate? What level of reporting that you want to have? And the way that I recommend doing it is basically saying, like, look, I want our relationship to be the best working relationship you've ever had with anyone that has reported to you. So let's define out what that should be. And so it's something that is that could really be appreciated on both sides, and it sets the table for you to have a great relationship with your boss, which is so important to someone ultimately being happy no matter where they are.
So let me ask you this. So let's say we go through this scenario. We negotiate. We get most of what we want. We talk to our boss, our hiring manager before we get started, and we build up that relationship of what their expectations are, what our expectations are when we're going to communicate, how we're going to communicate, what our reports are going to be like, what our one-on-ones are going to be like, and we get through all that part, and then we get into the job itself. How is it that we can stand out at the job and be one of those superstars that you talk about in your book?
So I think that there are a few key things that I would recommend. So first, you should realize that there is no substitute for hard work, that there's really only one way to the top, and that's through hard work. And in my experience, there's simply no substitute for rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty and doing that often. Right. And so I think that is absolutely key, no matter what your role. I think at a startup in particular, that there are a few other things that are super important. One is that in startups, you need to be able to summon the courage to make tough decisions, right? So one of the attributes of a startup typically is that there are less people doing more impactful things. And in a large organization, there may be committees and lots of people involved in making some fairly important decisions. And many cases, you're stifled. You can't even make those decisions on your own. And it's hard, right? And so I think in a startup environment, though, it typically is the polar opposite, where you really have to sort of ask yourself, are you daring enough to make the tough call? Do you have the guts to make a tough or unpopular decision? And so can you get all the facts, quickly assess the situation, and decide while others stand idle? So in particular, young professionals, I've seen many people sort of fear making the wrong decisions. And part of that is because most of them that you would make are not cut and dried. And the world does not exist in black and white. It often exists in shades of gray. And so having the courage to know that you might be wrong when the outcome is unclear, but deciding anyways, because you're going to be faced with those decisions, and no matter what role you're in, is really key. I also think that summoning the challenge of regularly challenging the status quo is important. So, particularly in larger organizations, there's kind of this saying of, well, we've always done things this way around here.
God, I hate that.
So the status quo is strong as hell, right? And so it represents in many ways a bias that can permeate the culture of even a startup company sometimes for keeping in place the current state of affairs. And that's because it's comfortable, it's predictable, it's perceived as less risky, but growth often requires change, right? And so being someone who can regularly challenge the status quo, I think, without question, is important. And I'll offer a couple of others, at least in my view. One is acknowledging the elephant in the room. So you, as a young professional, or really any professional, you're going to be in meetings where things may seem to be going great, you're getting stuff accomplished, and yet there's this one big issue that's hanging over everyone like a cloud. And so these are the issues, and they always come up, and sometimes when you least expect it, that everyone is thinking about, but nobody wants to discuss, and it's the big issue everyone tiptoes around, that is that elephant. And so what we're talking about is the obvious problem that no one wants to bring up. And because it's stressful, people want to avoid it, right? And so I think, unlike fine wine, elephants don't get better over time. They rarely vanish. And so being someone who can sort of bring that up in the right way head on. And finally, I think people who exude positive energy and optimism, and this is, I can't stress this enough, is that, and I love a quote from Winston Churchill when he said it in my mind just perfectly. He said, "A pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity, and an optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty." And so, do you see the cup as half empty or half full? Do you focus on the upside or the downside? And misery loves company in a large company or in a small company. And so, yet people who are positive and optimistic, it's contagious. It's the people that you want to surround yourself with. And so, there's going to be challenges. There's going to be negative events at a startup or really any company. And I'm not talking about being Pollyanna. What I'm talking about is that optimistic people don't sweat the small stuff. they're happier, they don't give up easily, they're promoted more frequently. And so managing a successful career, in my view, requires a high level of positivity.
No, that's well said. I think the that quote, I see that in a lot of people that are really successful is they don't really look at the difficulties that they're going to be facing, but they look at the positive outcomes that are going to come from those difficulties.
Without question. And that is one aspect that's something people can control, by the way. You could
Yeah.
control whether or not you choose to be positive and in do you hang out by the water cooler and bitch, or are you part of that positive viewpoint and part of the solution? In being the latter, you will achieve far more success in your career and be happier in the process.
Yeah, definitely be happier because I know I've been on both sides of that. I've been that, earlier in my career, it was kind of like you get in with the cool guys and they're going to complain. So you're going to jump in there with them. But then you realize like, God, this really sucks. I don't want to be 20 years from now. I don't want to be one of these guys just sitting here complaining about my career. So I'm going to take the bull by the horns and get out there and actually do something. And then you change your outlook into this positive side. And then you realize like, wow, I was wasting my life worrying about all this mess that these other people are doing and not focusing on the great things that I could be doing right now.
Precisely.
So we talked about all the good stuff with startups, or a lot of the good stuffs. What are some of the downfalls? Because I hear things that you have to work long hours. You don't get paid as much. Sometimes you're required to do things that aren't in your job description per se. What are some of those negatives that we have to watch out for, and how can we maybe adjust some of those perceptions when it comes to working with a startup?
Yeah. So I think the biggest drawback at a startup, right? So to me, just as an aside, so I'm kind of a workaholic, but I have learned how to create balance as well, and I don't see that as opposite ends of the spectrum, right? And so I think the biggest fear that most people have about joining a startup is long hours and getting burnt out and not having proper work-life balance. That is what you will hear most people communicate when they think of the downside of joining a startup. And so I think fundamentally, if you accept that as being one of the biggest potential drawbacks, then the question becomes is what do you do about it? And so what I found is, and this is something you won't typically hear from a technology executive, but to be at your best, you're going to have to live at your best. And never forget, take care of what matters most, and that's yourself and your family. And so what I believe that you need to do is you need to put your family first, right? And so what does that mean? What it means is learning how to defend your calendar. And where that starts out with is not booking or getting booked into wall-to-wall meetings each and every day, every single day of the week, right? What it means is looking out of the playing field ahead of time and very specifically carving out time in your calendar for both yourself and your family and doing your very best to stick to it. There's no perfection here, and sometimes people get hung up on that if they have to violate it once or twice. It just can't become regularly. And so your calendar, particularly as a young professional, could get stuffed with meetings, and yet there Warren Buffett. I remember reading about this story. Taught Bill Gates at one of their first times that they met, where Bill Gates felt that he had to have his calendar jam packed, and he looked at Warren Buffett's and it wasn't. And so he taught Bill Gates that at least according to Bill, that he felt that the only way that he could be successful is if he had every minute of every day packed, that he felt that that was the only way that you could do things, and that Buffett taught him the importance to giving yourself time to think, and that massive leaps in business, and to really stand out, you've got to come up with excellent, fresh, and innovative ideas. And that's not going to happen if you're booked wall to wall in meetings, on calls, answering emails, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the biggest things that I recommend is that you block out times in your calendar that are non-negotiable. And it's not easy. So for example, I once worked for a CEO who wanted the exec team to take people out to lunch around the company all the time. But at lunchtime, I wanted to work out, right? And so that was just non-negotiable. Didn't mean I didn't do it once in a while, but that was my time, right? And so, so being able to defend your calendar and to learn how to do that early on, where you are your own top priorities, where you are putting your family first, and not sacrificing one for the other, because time is your most precious resource in business and your personal life. As kids and grandkids grow up, marriages need nurturing, elderly relatives need attention too. And so all too often I've seen someone climb as high as they can in their career, and then you look at their weathered face in the mirror and realize they missed spending time with the people they valued most. And I think that that what you've got to do is to ask a tough question of yourself: is how can you be the most effective provider for your family? And the typical answer to that question is that work and income, might come first, but it's a slippery slope. And I think the right answer to that question is that work and family time are equally important, because they're interdependent. If you're unhappy in your professional life, it affects your personal life, and vice versa. So I really feel that the key is learning how to defend your calendar, putting yourself, your family first, and then finding that happy medium, all the while not getting stressed out when stuff happens, because it will never be perfect.
I think that's very well said. And that's something that when I first got into management, I did the stereotypical thing that I think a lot of managers do, and they just work and work and work. And then when my second child was born, I have three. And when the second one was born, I was like, I just can't do this anymore. And I just finished reading The 4 Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss. And this has been a decade ago or more. But I just finished reading that, and I thought, well, I'm going to just conquer my fears of what's going to happen. And I'm going to cancel meetings that I don't feel like are irrelevant to me. And I'm going to let my boss know, and I'm going to spend more time with my family. And I thought, well, I'm probably going to get fired for this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I went through and I looked at my calendar, and any meeting that I didn't really get a lot of value or feel like I gave a lot of value to, I sent an email and just said, my calendar is getting too full. I need to drop this meeting. If it's still important for me to find out the information of it, please send me the minutes of the meeting afterwards, and I can respond with any questions or comments that you have. And most people said, no, I don't think you need to attend. And I just got out of probably half of my meetings, my regularly occurring weekly meetings, just by an email like that. And then I let my boss know that, I'm going to start leaving work, between 5:30 and 6. And when I get home, I'm going to turn off my phone until my kids go to bed around 8:30, and then I'll turn it back on and check what I need to. But from the time I leave until about 8:30, I'm not going to be available. And that's it. Sorry, but that's the way it's going to be. And you know what? He was fine with it too. And everybody was fine with it. And all the fears that I had that I wasn't going to be a good team player kind of went away. And then in return, I felt like I got more work done, because I knew I had a time limit. I knew I had a deadline of when, 5 o'clock, I'm leaving at 5 or 5:30 or 6. So I have to get this done. And I just said, but was able to get more stuff done in a shorter period of time, because I knew I had that cut off.
Exactly. And I think what I love about that is that you were really respectful, and going back to the people that you were getting out of the meeting with, and then also getting some air cover from your boss, and people respect that. And because people are afraid to actually do what you did. And as you've well articulated, there's no need to be fearful of that at all.
Yeah, and I was terrified when I did it because I thought, well, I'm going to lose my job. This is, not the right time. I just had my second child, but it all worked out just fine. And now looking back on it, I probably wouldn't have been as successful as a manager if I didn't do that because it required me to delegate more. It required me to think, more strategy and less, task oriented. And in doing those things, I developed, more skills that I needed to be a better leader.
Absolutely.
So, I think this has been a fantastic overview about startups and getting in there. And I mean, you wrote a book about this. How can people find out more about your book, and where can they get a copy?
Well, so first of all, the name of the book is called "Be a Startup Superstar," and really, it's geared towards young professionals and college graduates, or really anyone who feels stuck in their corporate job. And it teaches them how to earn a great living doing what they love at a startup. And essentially, the book itself covers why work at a startup over a large corporation, how to find and land the best job at a startup. And once you've decided to join a startup, what are 35 actions, attitudes, and behaviors that you need to have to rocket your career to the C-suite and achieve success? It's loaded with a lot of how-to information that can be immediately translated into action. I think there's some interesting stories that illustrate that, and it's a quick, easy read. And you could find the book at beastartupsuperstar.com or search on amazon.com for Be a Startup Superstar.
All right. Well, thanks so much. Before you go, I wanted to ask you just a little bit about where you're at now and kind of, you said you've been bouncing around. You've been in a lot of startups over the years, taking them from, startup to publicly traded companies. Where are you at now? What's your company do?
So I am at, once again, I'm blessed to be at another amazing startup. It's a startup called Thycotic. We're in the cybersecurity space, and it's all about protecting privileged account passwords, which is, at least according to the Gartner Group, should be the number one priority of CISOs. It's a company that is delivering best-in-class solutions to that problem area. And we are growing like an absolute rocket ship and having a blast doing so.
Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with Thycotic. We use them for our secret server, for managing our privileged account passwords. We also use some of your free tools. You have some free tools that check for Active Directory weak passwords and such, and those have been fantastic.
Awesome. Thank you for being a customer, John.
Yeah, not a problem. All right. Well, thanks for coming on the show. And I'm going to link up your LinkedIn, your website, and the book in the show notes at geekleader.com so people can find it there. And thanks again. Thanks again for Steven from Thycotic coming on the show. And also special thanks to Splashtop for sponsoring this episode. And if you're looking for a new or better value for remote computer access solution, see for yourself why so many people are leaving other tools like LogMeIn or TeamViewer and switching to Splashtop. It's fast, secure, competitively priced, and to learn more and start a free trial plus an exclusive 20% discount for your first year, visit geekleader.com/splashtop. Again, that's geekleader.com/SPLASHTOP, Splashtop, geekleader.com/splashtop. Thanks so much and Merry Christmas.